simplifying things, when you have a thought or anytime your brain has any activity, there are these synaptic connections, and these different synaptic connections crudely represent a different piece of knowledge or a different understanding or something. So they're kind of code. And when one of them lights up, it indicates a part of your thought, or it contributes a part to your thought. So don't ever think of a thought as one thing. Think of a thought as a combination of a lot of things. So like if you think of Santa Claus, for instance, you might be lighting up a neuron that represents a fat guy, and one that's a guy with a beard, and another that's a guy with a smile, and another that's
red color.
Yeah, red color. All the details are represented individually, okay? And the connections between these are synapses. So you have synaptic connections, okay? So now that we know that all of these different neurons represent a piece of knowledge or understanding, let's now use the analogy of like the planet, okay? So we've got planet Earth, and now we've got all of these different cities across planet Earth, okay? And these are kind of like neurons. And the roads that go to those cities, connect differently. So basically what ends up happening is the roads that are traveled the most determine where we're likely going to end up. So this is just a fake example, but if we have
that's a great example. That's great.
Yeah, so if we have like city A and then city B and then city C and then city D and city E, don't pay much attention to how this looks, but if it's easier to get to, and then we have like city F here, and there's not much of a road. So if we have like a few different destinations that we can go to, the road that is the most traveled, the road that is the darkest, is going to be the path that we take. So like we might choose to take this path to get to city C instead of taking this road right here that's not very well traveled. Exactly. Yeah, so the more these are used, the more developed they become, and they become like these freeways that a lot of traffic can go through. And then maybe a road's not used at all and it goes into disrepair and you can't even really drive on it anymore. What happens is our thoughts are the same way. So the more we use those synaptic connections, they're like roads that become more traveled, and they go from being little paths to being freeways eventually. And so because they're easier to travel on and they're more familiar and the brain has a pattern of using them, they integrate more commonly. So the reason that this is important when it comes to our thinking or our cognition is that your brain is interpreting reality as a function of its past experiences. So if you have like a partner, for instance, if you're used to a partner who is abusive and is malignant towards you, it's likely that those familiarities, those synaptic connections are going to translate into your new experience and every subsequent experience, even though that experience might not actually be the same, or there might not be evidence that you should perceive it that way. Because you have this road more traveled in your brain, it's likely that you've built up those connections so much that they just become instinctual. And where this becomes a little bit more nefarious is in an abusive situation. Remember that this pattern or this dynamic is going on all across the brain, okay? And different parts of the brain are used for different things. So like the prefrontal cortex is used for executive thinking, the amygdala over here, or the reptilian complex, the brainstem, that's used for like fight or flight and basic instinct and breathing and things like that. Well, the more we activate our stress thinking or our stress neurons, or we develop patterns of information that we recall quickly that lead to stress, the less we exercise or we develop this higher cognition area, and the more we develop this area, this lower cognition area. And the reason that happens is your brain is like imagine you have like a couple of dogs and you keep giving food to one and you don't really feed the others. Well, the one that you're giving the food to or the attention to is going to grow the biggest and it's going to become dominant. And our brain's the same way. And if we continue to send the message to our brain that, I really need this thing. I really need this thing in order to survive. Well, it's going to say, okay, in order to keep so-and-so alive, let's develop this amygdala, this fight or flight thing, and let's repurpose energy that would otherwise go over here, or activity or development or evolution that would occur here in this higher area, and let's repurpose it over here so that this thing becomes more developed, because obviously what this person is experiencing is calling them to need, more of an amygdala.
Right, so are you saying that the only way that we can actually recreate our life and have a better future is just by retraining our brain? But how do we do that?
Yeah, so you have to take a few things into consideration. If your thinking has been distorted like this, you're going, so like, let's just use exercise as an example. If you've just been working your upper body out for so long and you have no strength in your legs, then the amount, first off, you're not going to understand how to train them very well. Second off, your strength in that muscle group isn't going to be very high. And third of all, it's going to take some work. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of repetition, not just one time in the gym in order to get it back up and running. So you take really a similar approach that you would to building a physical muscle that you would with this cognitive muscle. And you rely on the strength and the understanding of people who you can trust in order to help get you there. Because, we've already decided here that if this thing has been distorted, and if we can't entirely trust, if it has been created in order to serve a certain purpose, which is just to survive, and we need to elevate it into a higher purpose, well, it's going to be a much quicker path to get there through trusting in the thinking of somebody who you really can trust in, like a clinician that you can trust in, and your friends, your real friends, in order to help create an environment where this can develop. And what's so important is you have got to get out of using this. You've got to get out of overstimulating this. In order to get there, you have to create a feeling of safety. Well, part of what happens is we become addicted to stress because stress is what we're familiar with. And our brain recognizes, oh, if I have adrenaline going through me, I'm ready to fight and I'm ready to run. And I've needed to do that a lot. So I feel safe when I'm stressed because then I'm in a heightened state of awareness. So that's a really tough thing, is you have to get used to being comfortable and being calm. And there are specific exercises out there. Meditation is something that's helped some people. Meditation is something that's hurt some people too. Some people need more stimulation. And if they let their mind just kind of rest, maybe they're not ready for that yet. Maybe their brain needs a distraction. So meditation can be a great thing if a person's ready for it or if they're typed for it. But not every medication works for every person. But you have to just get to a place of safety where you can feel okay being safe and you can decide that you're going to stay there in that state. And then you have to have people around you who are kind of showing you what you can't see if you're blind, to certain things.
So do you think that one of the ways to start this process will be mindfulness, to be mindful of where your mind is constantly, like, I don't know, like being the babysitter of your mind, always and constantly understanding what are you feeling, how are you reacting, so you can retrain your mind to react in a different way?
Yeah. And I don't think you could say it any better than that, because, something that's important to remember is, our memory, our memory is what we do to understand the past. So understand the past in order to prepare for and predict the future, right? So, people who have been abused get into this addictive cycle of just ruminating on the past because they're afraid of the danger that will come in the future. And so the goal is to just figure out the past so that you can have some control in the future. And so there's an addiction to saying, well, why was I vulnerable? Or why did I anger somebody? Why did I lead them to, be aggressive towards me? Or, how can I run faster? Or how can I fight back harder? And so there's so much time living in the past. And
the past is gone. It doesn't exist in our memory.
Well, exactly. If, our brains only have so much power, you can't change anything in the past. And if you're living in the past and the present, then that means all you're doing is just living a series of repeat episodes of the same thing. So at some point, you've got to catch up to the present. You've got to step out of the past in order to start affecting the present. And the challenge becomes, if let's say you have a traumatic event that you remember, okay? So that's just represented here in this example. And so I keep thinking back to this event, and of course it wouldn't just exist in one place in your brain necessarily, but like, let's say I got into a fight, okay? So I got into a fight. Well, when I recall that memory, so when that memory is recalled, I'm reintroducing it into the present in a certain degree. My body's not smart enough to realize that I'm not actually threatened. If I'm focusing my consciousness on this memory, on that history, well, my body to a certain level thinks that that's happening in the present, and it's going to try to prepare me. So all I'm going to do is just continue over and over again, strengthening these patterns. Yeah.
Okay. So what if I, every time that I have a thought that is negative, we try to somehow change it to a positive one to reinforce the areas that we have not been using. But that's hard. Is there something that you can suggest, Doctor?
Well, one thing that doesn't help is to not be honest with yourself. And I think a lot of people try to solve for this problem by lying to themselves and saying, well, I'm just going to tell myself that I'm safe, or I'm just going to tell myself that the past wasn't real, or that, whatever the case may be. There are a lot of like Instagram memes about that stuff, and that just doesn't work. If you lie to yourself, you lose credibility with yourself, and you stop being able to trust your own thoughts. You never want to do that. So you want to be honest about, what's really going on with you.
So, do you think that it would be very useful just to do like child work or shadow work and look at the past, give it a really good look, try to get all the skeletons from the closet, and then understanding and forgiving yourself and understanding that you didn't know better at that moment that happened, just forgiving yourself and be compassionate to yourself? Do you think that that will help?
Yeah. So one of the best exercises I've ever heard is when we are thinking about the past, when it's appropriate to do that, try to think of yourself as a child, even if what happened a month ago or whatever. But think of yourself as a child. If I have a little kid walk into my house and they don't understand how a light bulb works and they drop it and shatter it, or they, whatever. That's not nearly as silly of a mistake as if I forget how a light bulb works as an adult, because I just say, okay, well, their understanding was different, than mine, and they learn that now, and things are different. And our life is a series of lessons. So if you think about yourself as like a physical child, having compassion for how it is that you could have made a mistake is way easier, and it's a way more accurate way to look at things. But from the time we're kids, we always think we're adults. I mean, it's impossible to know what you don't know. So we always think that we're intelligent enough to solve every problem, but that's really not true. So think of yourself as a child and think, okay, if a little, 4-year-old child were being screamed at for something that doesn't make sense, I would absolutely understand their sadness, and I would feel terrible for them, and I would want to love them and help them. And if that child's you, then you have to extend that same, love and courtesy to the child. And the other thing in response to your question that I kind of forgot to say was, one of the most important things I've ever learned about psychology is that sometimes we're chasing something that's actually not healthy. And if you're feeling anxious all the time, and if you're feeling stressed out, the world at large would tell you that you're not supposed to feel that way and something's wrong. And if you just sing a song or if you just exercise, that'll go away. Well, there's a chance that anxiety and that sadness and fear is actually your body working correctly, and it's trying to save you, and it's telling you your environment's broken, not your brain, but your environment is what's broken. And if that's the case, none of us want to feel that kind of anxiety, but it's the environment that needs to be fixed. And across the entire world, if we were to turn off an accurate stress response, it would lead people to not be as safe and to not live as long. Those things have been conserved to keep us alive. So I think the first question to ask ourselves in a lot of situations is there a good reason for me to be feeling the way that I'm feeling? Am I in danger? And if I am in danger, I don't necessarily want to keep feeling the stress, but maybe I need to take a different approach than thinking my mind is broken. And maybe I need to recognize that it could be my environment and my associates who are broken.
Well, nowadays, that people they cannot take the time or the courage to feel their feelings. Immediately we run away. We cannot sit with our feelings. We just, watch TV or drink alcohol or have addictions, just because we need to avoid to look inside and understand the feeling that we're feeling in our body, to be able to understand what's really happening, or even to have the capability of thinking, what is this? Where's this coming from? What is it triggering it?
And so when you think about making the time to improve your mental health, don't think of it in terms of how much time it's going to take in order to do that. Think of it more in terms of how much further you're going to get with every single moment that your mental health is improved once you start working on it, because you're going to make up for the time investment immediately. It's not going to take long. If you have difficulty interacting with people, if you're always feeling stressed, your memory suffers when you have anxiety, because your body prioritizes focusing on the things that you need, that you're manually focusing on, versus recalling memory and generating memory. I mean, think about what your life would be like if all of those things improved just a little bit. And it's not going to take you long to find, an hour of increased productivity that it takes you to talk to a therapist or to do something for yourself that improves your mental health. So, really kind of think like, okay, how far is it going? How long is it going to take me if I have a battery powered car and the battery is on empty, and I think, well, I don't have time to stop and charge my car, so I'm just going to drive, across the state at 5 miles an hour. Well, if you just stop and charge your car for a little bit, you're going to get to your destination a lot quicker. It's worth it. It's worth it to slow down, versus to just keep crawling along.
That's a really great visual. So make time, then face your past, treat everything like that is happening like you're a child with the same compassion. That means that you have to be compassionate to children to start with.
Well, kind of like where your focus goes, energy grows. And so if you continue to focus on pain and you do that under the assumption that you're going to prevent yourself from experiencing that pain in the future, just remember, you could, really be strengthening the centers in your brain that you're trying to avoid by continuing to go back into that state of thinking. You could be strengthening those. Now, in a therapeutic setting, with like a clinician, with a very good psychologist, thinking about the past in order to understand it is a necessary and an important thing. But when we're just driving around, and we're thinking about the trauma we've gone through and we're reliving it over and over again, it's unlikely that that's usually constructive. Even if you realize something sometimes in those states, most of the time you're not realizing anything. You're just reliving it.
You're just reliving it and reliving it and reliving it.
Right.
So is it better just to get your mind out, like a distraction?
I think, yeah, that's a really good question. It sounds like it could be in conflict with the other thing I said about being honest with yourself. So, never pretend something didn't happen. Never pretend that, you're not affected still by something that happened. It's not about lying to yourself, but it's about, not continuing to strengthen the memory and strengthen its influence. I think the best idea that I have, for what it's worth, is, treat yourself like you're giving advice to somebody else. And that's a good way to step away from your problems without becoming intimate with them. And, think about what advice you would try to separate your problem and say, this problem happened to my friend Carrie, and what would I tell her? And then tell her that. How would you
talk to her, right?
Yeah.
With
and
kindness, with love.
And then once it's this other, person's problem in the conversation, you're kind of free to say, okay, now how would she proceed? How would I ask her? How would I hope she would proceed? Mm-hmm. And then, try to replicate that and step away from it in the same way. It's obviously not a perfect science, but we give the best advice when we're giving it to somebody else, and we don't have the stress of thinking about the consequences of it.
Well, thank you very much. This is going to be helpful for so many people.